FM and WMNF.org. I'm Sean Canan, the host every Monday. My guest today is Jacqueline Lopez. She's a lawyer and Florida director of the Center for Biological Diversity's office in St. Petersburg. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, Jacqueline.
Thanks for having me.
And we're going to talk about some issues that are important to the environment in Florida. And one of the first things I wanted to ask you about is a press release that your office, that the Center for Biological Diversity released on Friday, and it has to do with green sea turtles. They were listed as endangered, but now they're going to be downlisted to threatened?
Yeah, that's correct. So sea turtles, green sea turtles, have been listed under the Endangered Species Act since 1978. And a few years ago, the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, the two federal agencies that are responsible for managing the sea turtles, received a petition to look at a population of these sea turtles in Hawaii and potentially delist them altogether. So at that time, these green sea turtles had been globally recognized as threatened, and our Florida breeding population had been treated as endangered for the purposes of regulations under the Endangered Species Act. So that petition started this rulemaking process where those two agencies further investigated the status of the species and determined that there are 11 distinct population segments, which means that each of these populations are discrete and significant into themselves so that they warrant specialized management regimes. And so for the population that breeds in Florida, it determined that it would no longer be treated as endangered, but instead downlisted to threatened due to a strong pattern of good nesting seasons in its main nesting areas, which include some portions of Florida, but mostly down in Costa Rica.
So that's all the same population?
Yeah, so our population has some strongholds in Florida, Cuba, the Yucatan area of Mexico, and in Tortuguero in Costa Rica.
I imagine that the downlisting and the somewhat recovery of the population has to do with people being aware of the nesting and what they should do. So maybe remind people, when is nesting season for these green sea turtles, and what should they watch out for when it comes to nests?
So Florida is very lucky. Most of our beaches in our southeast and southwest experience great nesting success from green sea turtles, loggerhead sea turtles, hawksbill, leatherback. So we actually have 5 sea turtles that nest on our beaches, and that season is pretty long. It can start anywhere as early as March and run through November, and that includes when the moms come up onto our shores to lay their eggs, all the way through when the very last hatchlings emerge from their nests. And so what you might see at beaches are areas that have stakes in the ground. They might have ropes around the stakes, and there might be some kind of language or signage that says that these are nesting sea turtles, please don't disturb them, please keep your dogs on a leash so that they don't dig up the nests. But for the most part, these sea turtles have been nesting on our beaches for a very long time, and they're gonna, as long as we have the beaches, continue to do so with minimal human intervention. We just need to kind of stay out of their way.
I want to give out the phone number. It's 813-239-9663 if you have a question about the Florida environment for Jacqueline Lopez from the Center for Biological Diversity, or any other environmental issues you want to ask us about. You can also send us a text to 813-433-0885 or shoot us an email, dj@wmnf.org. This downlisting, is it a proposal or is it definite?
So this is a proposal. So the agencies are accepting comments on the proposal for the next 90 days, and then it will take that feedback and incorporate any additional scientific information and come up with a final rule, including looking at whether or not the designation of critical habitat is warranted in our beaches.
What about the other, I think you said 4 other species of turtles. This only is applying to the green sea turtle. How are the populations of those other 4 species doing?
Kind of mixed. So we recently had critical habitat designated for the loggerhead sea turtle. That was last year, and that designation represented about 700 miles of beaches just in our coast down in Florida. Those populations are doing better than they have in the past. The interesting thing about the green sea turtle proposal and the status of all of these species is that the federal agencies acknowledge that the threats against them persist and might even be increasing. So some of those threats include interactions from fisheries. So one of the big achievements is having the inclusion of turtle excluder devices, which allows turtles to escape shrimp trawl fishing nets. But there are still many other types of nets that capture the sea turtles, and sometimes these rules aren't enforced uniformly throughout the United States. The proposal also discusses the threats about climate change and sea level rise and the impact that is going to have on the nesting habitat. So these sea turtles all share this very similar beaches. And so despite the fact that right now we see an increase in nesting, the agencies remain concerned, and we should remain vigilant about the future success of the species as they come back to their natal beaches to nest. So we're looking 12 to 15 years from now, these hatchlings, green sea turtles that are going out into the sargassum and as juveniles and eating and getting fat and happy, when they come back, are they going to have beaches that are suitable for nesting? And the agencies are very concerned about that, despite the fact that they've downlisted to threatened.
And I'm going to connect the dots a little bit on that. You're talking about because the seas are rising, the beaches are eroding more quickly than they might have otherwise, and the habitat for these green sea turtles might be declining because of that in the near future. And also, how does temperature, global warming and temperature affect sea turtle nesting?
Right, so exactly. So there's the two issues, the sea level rise, which is actually exacerbated by coastal development. So as we have our private properties along our coasts, we want to protect them from rising seas and storm surge, from increased storms and storm intensity, and that actually accelerates erosion. So, our beaches, if left unadulterated, would seasonally migrate, build up their dunes, and move as they need to deal with the tides. But when you armor your coasts, it accelerates the erosion by having this wave energy hit this hardened object, and it pulls the sand back into the water rather than dispersing it higher up into the beach as a reservoir for future beach development. So that is affecting erosion rates in sort of collaboration with the sea level rise. The rising temperatures is already affecting, for example, loggerhead sea turtles, which a study came out, I think in 2013, that says that the nesting population is moving further north, and part of that has to do with sea temperature, or with air temperatures, where the sex ratio of the hatchlings is affected. So now in Florida, we're seeing an overwhelming majority of our hatchlings as females. The temperature determines the sex of the hatchling, and so we have more than 90% of our hatchlings emerging as females.
How does that affect the population?
So it will, I'm not current on the science to know exactly how that's going to impact it, but I know that there is concern that that will affect future breeding success if you have a skewed sex ratio of male and female sea turtles.
So Rick Scott might get mad at me, but I'm going to continue to talk about climate change and switch gears to corals. Earlier in the month, the Center for Biological Diversity mentioned that the final federal recovery plan for elkhorn and staghorn corals near Florida and in the Caribbean includes a call for lowering carbon emissions that are driving ocean acidification and increasing ocean temperatures. The plan was released in early March by the National Marine Fisheries Service. It's a roadmap for saving those two coral species, which were listed as threatened species due to threats from climate change. Tell our listeners who haven't been lucky enough to dive in the Florida Keys or in the Caribbean about the elkhorn coral and the staghorn coral.
So these two coral species are what you would consider the traditional building blocks of our coral reef systems. They're huge. They are, if you imagine, sort of underwater rainforest. They provide the habitat that's necessary underwater for everything from the bottom of the food chain to the top predators. It's what makes life in our nearshore waters possible for our marine species. And this recovery plan, it is intended to address both the current threats to the species, and it also looks forward at how we're going to help the species survive long term and recover to a point to which the protection of the Endangered Species Act is no longer necessary.
And the specific part of the plan that you were focusing on in this press release was that carbon emissions is something that has to be taken into account when you're dealing with these corals and the recovery of these corals. Why would carbon emissions make a difference?
So for a coral, the two big threats are temperature and ocean acidification. And carbon emissions are affecting both of those things. So carbon emissions with respect to climate change and the increasing thermal temperature of our waters is making it more difficult for coral to persist. So for the recovery plan, it says that the periods of time where we have temperatures over 86 degrees need to be reduced to under 4 weeks out of the year. And that's necessary to allow the coral to go through their basic life functions and maintain their structure and have the symbiotic relationship with all of their other species that they need to survive to persist. With respect to ocean acidification, carbon that's emitted into the atmosphere is absorbed into our water. About 30 to 40% of the human-produced carbon goes back into our water, our oceans, our lakes, our rivers. And when it goes there, it goes into this chemical process where basically it just makes it more difficult for the species that need to build up shells to do that. It removes the chemicals necessary for them to have that structure. And so those are kind of the smallest species in our oceans that represent the base of the entire food web. And you remove those and you start to experience systematic collapse.
What's the likelihood of a recovery plan for Florida's endangered corals taking into account carbon pollution? Is that too much of a hot potato that people, it might not be included?
So the recovery plan calls for things that municipalities and the state can do right now. It addresses the short-term, near-shore issues like outfall, sewage issues, the things that we have a better local control over. Climate change, carbon emissions needs to be happening at a national and international level. It's a strong move forward for the president to identify these things as major issues and set definable targets to lower carbon emissions so that we're keeping these temperature periods below 4 weeks and we're keeping the level of CO2 in the water lower so that we can have a higher pH to support sea life, marine life. Whether that's going to be something that we can implement at the state under our current governor, one that is unwilling to acknowledge that climate change is a persistent threat against our state, clearly no. But national leadership, international pressure, hopefully will get us there.
That's the voice of Jacqueline Lopez. She's with the Center for Biological Diversity. She's the Florida director there and a lawyer. And my name is Sean Canan. You're listening to MidPoint on WMNF 88.5 FM and WMNF.org. It's almost 12:30 in the afternoon, and we'd like to take your calls. The number to call is 813-239-9663. You can also text us at 813-433-0885 or email us at dj@WMNF.org. Our first caller is Nate in St. Pete. Hi, Nate. What would you like to say?
Hi. I'm wondering how the cosmetics are specifically measured protection of the coral. I kind of read an article online that said that the coral is microbeads and then starve, like killing them. So it's like not just wondering how cosmetics can play a role in the health of our environment.
Right, so these microbeads that you can find in as abrasive components to face washes and hand soaps and things like that. There's a lot of awareness being drawn to this issue right now. I'm more familiar with sort of the cumulative effect of these microplastics entering into the marine environment and being absorbed at the smaller organism level and then sort of bioaccumulating up the food chain into, even we see impacts in sea turtles where you have high plastics content. The reason plastics are so harmful is that they readily absorb, they're readily absorbed by the fats in these species and can present systemic problems to marine wildlife.
And I'm going to be speculating here, Nate, but it seems like if the corals eat these microbeads, which have no nutritional value, just even getting rid of the toxic components of it, they're eating that. They're filling up their guts with things that are not nutritious. That might be why they might starve.
That's That's a great question. I'm not actually aware of any resources offhand, but I'm sure that some exist that identify which of the products that are out there that have these chemical compositions. Yeah, I would say you probably should stop using to the extent that they're advertised. And actually the manufacturers advertise them as a benefit for your beautification, for your hygiene, for whatever the beads are intended to be beneficial for. So it will probably be pretty notoriously posted that it has those types of things in them.
Nate, thanks so much for your call. If you'd like to join the conversation, the number is 813-239-9663. You can also give us a text at 813-433-0885 or an email at dj@wmnf.org. I'd also like to ask Jacqueline about 2 Florida plants that are threatened by sea level rise. The Center for Biological Diversity is asking for protection for almost 8,000 acres of endangered species habitat protection in Florida. What are these plants, and what's the habitat that you want protected?
So these are 2 coastal species in the southeast and southwest Florida, and the Fish and Wildlife Service has proposed designating critical habitat about 8,000 acres total for each of these species that are coastal species, and one of the primary threats against them currently is sea level rise. So on our east coast we have the Florida semaphore cactus, and on the west coast we have the Aboriginal prickly apple. And the Fish and Wildlife Service has determined that a lot of the sites where these species persist will be inundated by seawater in the foreseeable future, and has identified some upland habitat areas where the species probably should be transported or sort of involuntary relocated so that they can survive sea level rise.
The Aboriginal prickly apple is found in Manatee County, Charlotte County, Sarasota, and Lee counties, so it's in our listening area. I don't know much about this Aboriginal prickly apple. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, it's pretty rare. So there are about fewer than 500 individuals left, scattered among about 11 different populations, and each of those sites will be inundated with sea level rise within the next 50 to 60 years.
Almost everything, it seems, that we've talked about Florida and the environment, it touches on climate change, climate disruption, global warming, sea level rise, ocean acidification. It seems like this all is coming together, and everything is affecting these Florida organisms. I mean, these organisms in Florida have evolved to the climate that Florida has or has had over the last millennia, but now if it's changing really rapidly, they might have trouble, and yet it is a political issue. And so I'm going to go right now to something that happened in Tallahassee last week. And that's where so Governor Rick Scott's office was inundated by protesters. The environmental and open government advocates were armed with a petition seeking an investigation and a public records request for documents. Florida Public Radio's Jim Ash is reporting they have the hope to get to the bottom of allegations that Scott is ordering his agencies not to refer to climate change.
Floating around the Capitol for weeks. Governor Rick Scott has